Good afternoon and welcome to the ASCENDx Summit Space Policy and Education session on space law. If you have any questions for the speakers during this session, please enter them into the chat feature above. And now we are pleased to welcome our moderator, Michelle Hanlon, co-director of the Center for Air and Space Law at the University of Michigan School of Law.
Thanks, Haley. It's the University of Mississippi School of Law. We are one of the only universities in the U.S., including University of Nebraska, who is also represented here, that has an air and space law program. So thank you everyone for joining us. For those of you who don't know me, I'm also the co-founder of For All Moonkind, which is the only organization in the world focused on preserving cultural heritage in outer space, and hence the banner in my background. This session is really special, and I'm so thrilled to be moderating it. We're going to be exploring two questions. First, what will the 21st century space industry look like? And second, how can educational institutions prepare the lawyers of tomorrow? I think you'll see from the promos, the individuals on this panel are simply amazing. They bring both passion and incredible experience of space law to the table with them. I also want to thank the co-director, my co-director at the Center for Air and Space Law, Charles Stotler, for actually bringing all these amazing people together. It's a true honor to be moderating this panel. And I know you don't want to hear anything more from me because we have a lot to talk about from these people from very different perspectives. We're going to run this panel as a discussion sort of, and we really hope that you have a lot of questions that we can field for you. But to get things started, I've asked each of the panelists to sort of just talk about themselves and how they got into space law to get us started and to get the discussion flowing. So I'd like to start with Dr. Andrea Harrington. Andrea, if you could just tell us a bit about yourself, your path to space law, and then against that backdrop, let us know what space law actually means to you.
Hi everyone. As Michelle mentioned, I'm Andrea Harrington and I am a space lawyer. So I actually started out doing insurance law, not space law, after law school. I was drafting insurance policies and endorsements in the insurance sector, not dealing with space at all. And I thought to myself, hey, you know, this job is fine. This is great. I don't mind doing this. I don't mind going to work every day. But if I look back at the end of my career, what am I really going to feel that I accomplished with my career? You know, where am I going to be at the end? Am I going to be proud of the career that I made when it comes to retirement at some point? And I thought that I really needed to move into something that I felt passionately about. And the only thing that I've really felt passionately about my entire life is human use and exploration of outer space. I grew up both watching launches on television, you know, the actual NASA launches from Kennedy Space Center, but also watching a whole lot of science fiction, in particular, a whole lot of Star Trek. And it really gave me a passion for the potential that the human race has to extend our activities into outer space and what we can learn from outer space and how we can grow as a civilization based on our activities in space. And for a long time, I thought, well, there was no place for me in space because I am not a scientist. I'm not an engineer. I'm terrified of math, like many lawyers are. And so I thought, well, space just isn't the industry for me. But I discovered space law as a field and I thought, well, this is perfect. This is really where I belong. And so I left my work in the insurance industry and I went up to McGill in Montreal and I did the LLM, the Masters in Air and Space Law. And I decided that I wanted to delve further from an academic perspective into space law and that I was interested in teaching space law long term. And so I did the doctoral program at McGill as well to get an academic doctorate in air and space law. And then from there, I moved first to teaching at the University of Mississippi, where Michelle is now, and then subsequently to Air Command and Staff College, which is where I am now, two very different teaching contexts. In this role at Air Command and Staff College, I'm educating primarily military officers, U.S. Air Force and now U.S. Space Force. We've had our first set of transfers into the Space Force, as well as sister services and international officers, and a small number of U.S. government civilians as well. And so it's a different, but certainly also rewarding teaching environment that I'm in. And I'm sure I'll get to talk a little bit more about that as we move further into the panel, but I just want to make sure to leave enough time for all the panelists and discussions. So I'll cut it there and please feel free to ask me any questions that you're interested in as we come back around to the question section.
Thanks, Andrea. I love the progression from insurance to Space Force. I think it really shows the breadth of space law and the ways, the paths to it. I also came from commercial law. I was a business lawyer for 25 years before I became a space lawyer. So Andrea is now teaching very important, to our U.S. military. I'd like to now turn to Alicia. Alicia, given that you work with Axiom Space, I imagine your path to space law and your description of space law might be a little bit different. Can you share a little bit about yourself, what Axiom does, and again, against that backdrop, let us know what space law means to you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Michelle, and thank you, Andrea. I think similarly to the two of you, my background did not begin with space, although I've had the opportunity to do this work for several years now. At the outset, I was focused on the intersection between business entrepreneurship and the sciences, both in my undergrad, grad school, and the early stages of my career. And I would describe it in a nutshell as an interest in human future technologies ventures. So exploring industries with the potential for dramatic growth and also for impact essentially on the trajectory of the human species. I spent a bit of time in-house doing leverage finance. I worked on Wall Street. I worked in-house at a large nonprofit and at a small private surgical devices company. And I think space law effectively epitomized sort of the best, the most exciting, most intense, and also fit that category of growth potential for me. And in particular, I think one element of this work that's exciting on a daily basis is that it both has a high level of uniqueness versus pretty much every industry out there. And yet there is also a core that is consistent across industries. So it is just as important at any space startup as it is in any non-space startup to have the basics, to have infrastructure, to have the elements that make for good corporate functioning that support your staff. And so as a lawyer, there are numerous opportunities. And I think in particular, in early stages to take leadership roles, but also to take on execution roles. So at Axiom, I am the Chief Counsel and Director of Corporate Operations. And what that means is that I get to be involved in the financial aspects of the organization, invoicing, payment, management of vendors, intersections in contracts across the company, work with the board. So anything ranging from resolutions, the annual meetings, the programs and processes that the board has to approve here as they do in any other organization. So I would say it's both the opportunity to work in the space sector in general, the opportunity to do the things that I think a lot of us may have gone to law school and had an opportunity to learn, but not everyone gets a chance to apply in their day-to-day work. And in-house, in particular, in-house in a space startup allows you to fulfill all those desires. And I would say that on the topic of growth, obviously, this is an industry that at a time that a lot of industries are struggling, still has many pockets of growth and on the horizon, expected expansion. And when I looked across the space industry itself, Axiom in particular represented that to me. Everyone's familiar with the annual ISS multi-billion-dollar spend. There's just a lot of both public funds, private interest out there. So there are many, many reasons why I joined, but I'm really excited to be here and appreciate the invitation from Ascend and also the opportunity to speak next to the other esteemed panelists. So I'm looking forward to the other Q&A and happy to share any other perspectives that I can.
Thank you, Alicia. I loved, I really sort of focused on one of the opening comments you had about being interested in the trajectory of the human species. And I think that that's really sort of what space law is fundamentally about. A lot of people think Star Wars and Space Force, and I think even Andrea would agree, no, it's really just about looking to our future, looking to this humanity that we can build together using the tools that space law has given us. So thank you very much. Really look forward to your additional comments. I'm going to turn now to Elspeth. Elspeth, you're the Director of Technology, Security, and Space Law Initiatives at the University of Nebraska Law School. As you tell us more about what you do and how you got there, can you describe how space relates to technology and security? Some would say the three are inseparable.
Yes, thank you so much for having us here, Michelle, and thank Charles for putting this all together. I'm delighted to be here today. So I actually have a technical background. I came to law school by way of being a web developer. I've loved technology since I was a kid, and breaking computers and breaking any piece of technology I could get my hands on. My poor parents, but that's always been a big part of who I am. In that role as a web developer, I actually worked for a group of lawyers developing training websites. And hit the road with them and spent a lot of time working with attorneys, and realized that I really enjoyed the thought processes that they were going through and how they were approaching problem solving. And I found that really interesting. So I took my love of technology with me to law school. And in law school, a lot of my work actually focused on cyber issues. I was not terribly space focused at the time in law school. And actually, I loved hearing that Andrea did insurance when she first left law school. We have that in common. I clerked for the Department of Insurance. And actually, I find that I reference a lot of those skills now in terms of administrative law. So it's actually a wonderful precursor, I think, in some ways to the space law industry. But I was really focused on e-discovery issues and digital evidence. And so I was really technology and cyber focused and hadn't really started into the space set of things yet. Found it really interesting, but just didn't know that much. And so when I started in this position, I audited all of our classes and sort of started to get fascinated and really, really interested in space, as well as the kind of the cyber background, especially the civil cyber background that I had. So in my role here, I oversee our space, cyber, and telecommunications law program, which is about 10 years old, 11 years old now. I also oversee a brand new center called the Nebraska Governance and Technology Center, which you alluded to, and that's why my title is sort of ambiguous, I suppose, about technology, security, and space, right? But I'm kind of dual-hatted in that. And that center's role is to really look at the intersection between law and technology and how we govern technology. And so we do a lot of really broad work there. And of course, some of that is going to touch on space, because technology is a key part of how we interact with space, and how we are developing those technologies, and how we may regulate or not regulate those technologies to their benefit or to their detriment, depending on how the law impacts them. So that's a lot of what we study here. And I agree, I think those things are incredibly interrelated, and an important discussion from both sides.
Sorry about that pause. Thank you. That's great. I love sort of your description of how you got into it, because what you really emphasized to me is that this concept of space law is constantly growing and changing. And, you know, when you talk about your title being changed, I mean, that's just what it is. It's space law is not a static field. So it's really not for the faint of heart. You know, it's going to become a lot more faster paced than it has been in the past. And we need a lot more diversity in space law, and we need a lot more space lawyers who are bringing in these different experiences, not just professional, but also geographic and cultural experiences, because that's what's going to make space law really hum. So thank you for that. And, you know, I feel like I have so many questions for all of you, but last and most definitely not least, we have Jessica. Jessica, as you introduce yourself and share your path to space law, as well as what NanoRacks does, perhaps you can give us sort of a taste of a day in the life of a space lawyer at NanoRacks.
Hi, Michelle, and thank you so much both for having me on this panel. Thank you to AIAA. And I am incredibly humbled to be on this panel with women who are so accomplished and who have already achieved so much in their career. So I am appreciative to be here with all of you. So to give a little bit of background about NanoRacks, so we consider ourselves a commercial space company. We were started in 2009, and primarily we have provided sort of a method to be able to put your payload on board the International Space Station. And this started with internal payloads based on the CubeSat form factor. But this has expanded and grown. to external payloads outside of the station, as well as satellite deployments from station and with different launch company partners. And one of our biggest projects to date so far has been the Bishop airlock, which will be the world's first commercial airlock, and that hardware is going to be shipped to the International Space Station. It has already been placed on board the Dragon trunk. So right now, I believe it's still scheduled for fall 2020 launch. So we're very excited to see that come to fruition. Also a little bit about me and my background. I think similar to a lot of the other folks on the panel, I didn't start out really focused in space law. I went to law school with the goal of studying international law and sort of the intersection of international trade and human rights. But while I was in law school, one of the classes that was offered and part of the Comparative and International Law Institute program I was in was space law. And I'd always had a love of space, but had sort of thought throughout my life, I was not a scientist. This wasn't a field for me. But once I saw that there was this class, it suddenly opened up a world of new possibilities. And from that, I started going to events, to panels like this, although they were in person, you know, pre-COVID times, in the DC area. And to be honest, you know, I think the question gets asked a lot about career paths in space law, and I don't think I've ever heard one that would be considered maybe a true traditional path. Everyone takes a bit of a roundabout way to get there. My path included working as a criminal prosecutor in southern New Mexico for a few years at the beginning of my career, before moving back to DC and jumping on board with the satellite regulatory team at SES Networks, and then with another consulting firm in the DC area, LMI Advisors, before coming to NanoRx. So it's never quite straightforward. And as to what a typical day in the life is for general counsel, again, I don't know that there is a typical day. There are so many questions that can come up just in the in the course of a day in the life of a company. I think Alicia really hit a lot on the diverse issues that a company is looking at, and it's not just space related. You're looking at corporate governance, you're looking at employment, you're looking at transactions, you're looking at your compliance requirements. All these things across the board can make for a different experience every day. And I think that's one of the exciting things about working in-house with a space company, is that it isn't always the same. So I'll leave it there, and we can jump into more questions. I look forward to hearing more from the other panelists.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, and I think, again, this sort of diverse backgrounds of how we all got to where we are. I think, though, there seems to be an undercurrent to me, and that's sort of this humanity. And you talked about focusing on human rights. And it's something that I try to stress a lot when I teach here at Mississippi, law is about humans, and law is about relationships between humans. And so now we're adding this sort of, we've kind of figured out how to do it on Earth, right? But now we're factoring in this whole new sort of space component. Now we all know, I think, and most people listening probably know, space law is not something new that just popped open yesterday, right? We've had outer space treaties and international law since the 60s. We have soft law, hard law, we have all sorts of things going on, but it's traditional space law has always been considered a piece of public international law because it's been the outer space treaties regulate sovereign states. So Alicia, I'm wondering what current developments in space law and space policy are most profoundly affecting the work of lawyers in-house, like places like Axiom.
Thank you, Michelle. That's a great question. And as a bit of background, I just want to reference both the topic that you brought up earlier about, this concept of how we regulate or don't regulate technology. And that also had a nexus with the comment, or excuse me, Elizabeth, you made that comment with the comment that Michelle made. I think one of the most exciting aspects of this work is that we are building something truly new. So at the same time that our engineering colleagues are building, in Axiom's case, physical facilities on orbit, but across the industry, really truly building new products and new services, growing the low Earth orbit economy, we naturally are encountering the requirement not only to create new regulatory structures, new contractual mechanisms, but to work closely with the government across the board on all of these. So we, on a day-to-day basis, encounter novel questions of how to apply the current law and also how to draft and document and coordinate the work that we do. So it's incredibly challenging. It can be daunting at times, but it's really exciting to sit down and hash out with both our commercial colleagues and our government colleagues. How do we structure this? How do we word it? What are the implications, the approvals? How does this play out in a logistical basis? So I would say that there's a sort of granular day-to-day high-touch component of the work that I think it's really omnipresent, and it's one of the most I think incredible elements of working with a space startup, which is that you are crafting and contributing and building what will be the future precedents. So at the same time that we're looking back to maritime law, et cetera, we are basically writing the next chapter. So I think the most exciting development is the stuff that we're doing at this very moment in our office, in offices across the nation and across the world.
Thanks for that. I think, I like this very sort of liberating feeling of space law, and I kind of giggle when I get second-year students in, because your entire first year of law school is all about, oh, here's the law, here's the Constitution, and they get into my space law class, and they're like, oh, well, what's the law there? And I'm like, there isn't one there. There's some guidelines that we need to follow, and we need to, what we're doing at Mississippi is we're training students to think about how you develop the law. We're not applying the law anymore, right? So it's really, I look at everybody on the panel, I think, wow, that's my dream job. So so just to sort of work off of that, Jessica, do you think current space activities with commercial parties like this require rethinking space law completely?
So it's an interesting question. And I was thinking about this a lot last night about whether it requires actually rethinking space law, or really just sort of further clarifying it, or clarifying and drilling down what we mean when we talk about space law. As you mentioned, there are these open areas. I mean, it's not, it's not as black and white as what you get in torts and property and your first year law classes. However, those defined areas still have an impact on space law. I mean, when I think about, again, my day-to-day activities, the outer space treaties really don't impact the decisions or the advice that I need to give my client on a day-to-day basis. But other, sort of well-settled areas of law, administrative law, regulatory compliance, and contract law. These are all things that there is an existing body of law for. And I think that when we talk about space law, we really need to wrap our minds around that aspect as well. Is that space activities are a business. And so there's already a framework in place. Additionally, we do have regulatory, sorry, my apologies. We have regulations in place for certain types of space activities, for launch, for satellite communications, for remote sensing. And one of the things I think we've seen within the past few years with this administration has been a push to adapt and to modernize those regulations to keep up with the changes in the industry. So I think that's been one of the that has been a positive aspect of federal regulatory practice when it involves the space industry in the past few years.
So I think it's really key what you said, space activity is business, it wasn't before. Space activity used to just be about exploration and, perhaps national bragging rights. But now space activity is a business. So anybody who's interested in getting into space law, you have to know all that other law. You can't ignore everything else that is going on terrestrially, because everything that happens on Earth, ultimately, we're going to bring to space with us. But you also gave me sort of a perfect segue in terms of this administration, right? Because that brings us to Space Force. And Andrea, I was just wondering, given the work you are doing now, do you think the nature of Space Command as a geographic command, is that going to change how commercial actors fulfill government contracts, or does it change how they should think about risk?
So first of all, I just need to give my disclaimer before I give any comments to say that I'm speaking in my personal capacity as an individual academic. My views do not represent the views of the US Space Force, the US Air Force, the Department of Defense, or any other part of the US government. So getting into that, to the specific question that you just asked, and I'll circle back to some of the broader questions about continuity between administrations and development of space law overall. But no, I don't think that there's a substantial difference now that we have US Space Command as a geographic combatant command. It used to be its own combatant command from 1985 up until 2002, and then it was stood down, became part of STRATCOM, and then we've stood up US Space Command again. At this point, US Space Command has been given an area of responsibility starting from 100 kilometers above mean sea level, and there have been clarifications to state, no, that it's not the US position that this is the line of demarcation where space begins, but rather this is just, for ease of operations and for efficiency's sake, this is the area of responsibility for this particular command. And I don't think that makes a particularly substantial difference with regard to companies that are going to do business in space or do business with the US. We have seen this pivot to commercialization in space, which started substantially, it started back in 2004, but substantially reinvigorated in 2010 with the Obama space policy, and has carried through with continuity into the Trump administration as well. And one good example of that, it has been the US position on space resource extraction and utilization. So in 2015, President Obama signed a law into force in the US that had been passed by Congress, enabling private companies to extract, use, and sell commercially space resources. And then that's been carried through further by the Trump administration. There was an executive order that came out in April of this year addressing exactly that point as well. And the Artemis Accords address space resource utilization as well in a similar way. And so that has been something that we've seen come through as both administrations have really placed an emphasis on the commercial uses of space. And from the Space Force perspective, I think the creation of Space Force actually helps to bolster that commercialization of space in the sense that from a security perspective, part of the Space Force mission is really protecting those uses of outer space that are in compliance with international law. If you look at Space Policy Directive 4 that came out from the Trump administration and pushing for the creation of the Space Force, the very first priority that it lists on the list of priorities in Space Policy Directive 4 is protecting the nation's interests in space and the peaceful use of space for all responsible actors consistent with applicable law, including international law. And so one of the important missions of Space Force actually is upholding that international law to create that certainty that that right of use and exploration of outer space is going to be preserved for all countries. And a byproduct of that is that commercial entities have a certain amount of business certainty that they're going to be able to continue to do business in space and have their interests protected in space as long as they're engaging in a lawful way in outer space. And I think that's really important. And so I think you really have to take space activities holistically from a commercial, from a civil, and from a military perspective, because trying to separate one from the other is quite difficult. And in terms of not only national interests, but the interests of humanity in further developing our space activities, our space exploration, our space use, I think these things really do all go hand in hand and serve in supporting each other in our continued growth, development, and exploration in space.
Thanks, Andrea. I think it's a really good point that you can't, in this 21st century workforce, you can't narrow down your vision. You have to keep broadening your vision and keep thinking about how all these other things impact each other. And so it's really, always thinking 4 steps ahead of what you're doing in order to understand the repercussions of any decisions or regulations or laws or, commercial activity that you're doing. I'm going to switch gears just a little bit, Elspeth. We can't ignore what's going on here on Earth. When we look at sort of this 21st century workforce, do you think recent events have changed the way that you would sort of put that together, what you would require from it?
Yeah, so I want to start that question by thinking about how the 21st century workforce already, I think, looks a little bit different. Just in the 10 years that I have been engaged in the sector, sending out graduates and seeing people working in space law and policy and engaging in that, whether they're with the government, private sector, or working with the military, the first thing that I particularly notice is that we still have a lot more public understanding of space. I don't know about the experience the rest of you are having, but when I talk to people about what I do at dinner parties, and we could still have dinner parties 6 months ago, people have a much broader understanding that space law is a thing that needs to exist, right? That they have a bigger understanding of the satellite industry and what that means and what that is. 10 years ago, I still spent a lot of time validating it was a real study area, right? And I spend a lot less time doing that now than I did then. The other thing I think is really interesting about the students and the graduates who are maybe 5, 6 years into their career now is that even if they cut their teeth in another industry, they often have taken space law courses or cyber related or technology related courses in law school. Whereas even 10, 15 years ago, a lot of the attorneys working in the field maybe had no background education in it and had to learn on the job. And clearly there's benefits to all of that. But I think it's a very big kind of pivot that we're seeing now, that we have students who are falling in love with space law principally while they're in law school, right? When they're a 1L, a 2L, a 3L, and start exploring some of those ideas. And that's a big change in the field, and people who are thinking about some of these really tough issues for a really significant period of their career, maybe before they're even in decision-making positions in the field. So I think that's a really interesting change. Another thing that I think is becoming rapidly more important, and pedagogically, we put a big emphasis on interdisciplinary study. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more coming up, so I won't get into it too deeply here. But one of the things that I think I see evolving and changing is this notion of a common language when we're talking about space across all of these sectors and across disciplines. And the evolution of that, I think, is particularly interesting.
Thanks, Elspeth. I'd like the way you sort of encapsulate how the change in the industry and the concept of the workforce and space law. I'm sure we all still get the sort of really space law is a thing, a space lawyer, and it's fun. It's really fun to sort of go out into the real world outside of our space bubble and talk to people. Sadly, of course, that doesn't happen as much anymore. So we talked about sort of what the landscape looks like now. So what are we want to sort of talk about what lawyers of the future can do to help achieve the goals we've talked about, sort of making this, influencing this the trajectory of human species and humans into space. So I'm going to go back to Andrea. In your experience, what are some of the biggest misconceptions lawyers need to dispel about space activities and space law. And I also want to, you and I have talked a lot about what other non-space lawyers need to know about space law. And I would love for you to talk about that at this point as well.
Okay. So let me make kind of 3 separate and distinct points here in response to Michelle's questions. So first, if you're an aspiring space lawyer, what misconception can I dispel for you as you're getting into space law? And that's that you can be just a space lawyer. I think as all the panelists here have indicated, we've all had areas of expertise elsewhere. We've engaged our professional skills elsewhere in addition to space law. And so if you really want to be marketable and make a career in space law, you also need to have another area of legal expertise that's going to be valuable to you. So for example, for me, it's insurance. For other lawyers, it might be labor law, it might be administrative law, it might be cyber law, areas that have significant overlap with space and that are going to be important to any company that's doing business in space. Export controls, intellectual property, these are all areas that are valuable secondary areas to have as your area of focus as you are getting into space law to make yourself a marketable person in that area. The second point I want to hit on is that one of the misconceptions that I think space lawyers need to dispel, and that I have certainly made a major goal of mine to dispel, is this idea that the Outer Space Treaty is incredibly restrictive. That the Outer Space Treaty tells you a whole lot of things that you can't do in space, and that it hinders our freedom of action, and that it's a problem. I really strongly disagree with that. I think it's a misconception that a lot of folks have. I don't necessarily think it's a misconception that a lot of space lawyers have, but I think it's a misconception that a lot of people in the broader space world have, that they think the Outer Space Treaty prohibits a lot of things that it doesn't. The Outer Space Treaty is really an enabling document. On its face, by its very title, it deals with exploration and use of space. Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty guarantees that right of free exploration and use for all states in engaging in those activities in outer space. And the rest of the Outer Space Treaty only limits those freedoms in so much as it is necessary to ensure the preservation of that right for all other states, so that I jokingly call parts of Article 9 the prime directive. I've heard others refer to it as the golden rule, to say, you have your freedom of use and exploration in outer space, but you have to act with due regard. You can't infringe on the rights of other states to engage in free use and exploration of outer space. And so the modifications to that right that the Outer Space Treaty enacts are really meant to preserve the right for everyone else, rather than to limit our own freedom of action. And in fact, in particular on the military side, the restrictions imposed by the Outer Space Treaty are much less than what people tend to perceive them as, and that's a whole separate lecture, and I'll save that for itself. But the restrictions imposed on military activities in space are actually quite minimal, unless you're actually talking about celestial bodies. So the value of the Outer Space Treaty as a cornerstone document for us to build upon and to create a stable base for ensuring that states are able to continue to engage in space activities in a way that is going to be sustainable. And I don't just mean that in an environmentally sustainable way, but sustainable for the long term, to continue to grow civil, commercial, and military uses of space in a way that is going to benefit all mankind. And I would argue that space activities have benefited all mankind as they are intended to from Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty. The last point is talking about space law for non-lawyers, and it segues well from my second point, I think, in saying that there is a minimum level of understanding that people that are operating in the space sector need to know about space law, even if they are not lawyers. And that goes for people who are engaging in space business, but it also goes for the governmental space actors, including the military space actors that are in outer space. We need to have a basic understanding of what the treaty says, because if we don't, that's when you start getting all these conversations that I've heard tell of people saying, oh, the Outer Space Treaty is a hindrance, we need to get out of it. Okay, well, that's not actually true. Go talk to a lawyer, listen to one of our panels, read through the treaty, have a conversation with us, engage the lawyers, learn a little bit about the Outer Space Treaty and understand what it does and doesn't bring to the table. And that'll help you to plan for your activities long-term and ensure that your activities are going to be able to move forward successfully. I really see space law as an enabler. And if we can all start thinking of it as an enabler, then we can see the benefits for folks who are engaging in the space sector who are not lawyers, having an understanding of, okay, how does this law enable me to continue to grow to grow my business or to move forward in meeting my objectives.
So we got a question from the audience. I will keep you on just for another minute or two. The question is, what about real estate law? Can there be an authority consistent with the Outer Space Treaty that can authorize an entity of some kind to build a city and sell habitations on Mars?
Is that for me? I'm happy to take it, but I don't want to. Okay.
No, that's for you. I think it dovetails nicely with what you've just been saying.
So selling habitats, I think, is an interesting way to phrase that, because that is how the question is phrased, because there is not a problem with owning an asset, right? States maintain ownership of their space assets that are registered to them in space. And so if you had a habitat, that facility can be owned by a state. And then if that state were to so allow, an individual, private company or person to own the habitat under domestic law, the state would have that ownership and responsibility at the international level. And then the private entity or private individual would have that ownership or responsibility in the domestic law regime at that level. But you can't own a plot of land. So if you're talking about the habitat, the physical structure that you're living in, you can own that. You can't own the plot of land on the moon or Mars. And that's because of Article 2 of the Outer Space Treaty, which is the non-appropriation principle. So you don't have territorial jurisdiction in outer space to be able to allow a state to have a regulatory mechanism for selling plots of land and for registering those sales of plots of land. That is not applicable. But that does not mean you cannot own the building that you live in or the habitat that you live in, and the state exercises quasi-territorial jurisdiction over that facility that you're inhabiting.
Thanks, Andrea. I'm going to now go, pull us back into sort of the near future versus the far future. We're not on Mars yet, but we are talking about a new space economy. And so, Jessica, as you look at NanoRacks and some of the exciting work that's being done there, what do you think the primary role of the lawyer is in the new space economy? I think Andrea made a really good point that part of the role of a space lawyer is to educate the entire public about what space law is. But in terms of in this new space economy, has the role of the lawyer changed at all from tradition?
I think that it really depends on your place and where what your professional role is. Whether you are a government attorney with NASA, the FAA, the FCC, or with the DoD. I mean, your considerations and your advice to your client are going to be, slightly different than what they would be working in-house or working as, a private attorney working in a law firm. But overall, big picture, I do think that as lawyers in the space industry, one of the things that we should be cognizant of and be educating the public on are the problems that we are facing as far as space situational awareness and orbital debris, and making sure that we are also directing, or not directing, but rather advising our clients on how to be responsible stewards of that environment. I mean, a lot of what this comes down to is risk. What amount of risk is your client going to be able to withstand? Looking at, from my perspective as in-house counsel, in regard to its business plans. But this, I think, you have that same issue when it comes to your government stakeholders as well. What amount of risk can they stand, and what are their obligations under the outer space treaties? So I think that as we move forward, that is one aspect, I think, where space lawyers or lawyers just in this industry overall can have more of a say. And, you know, personally, not speaking for NanoRx itself, personally, I think that we all have a responsibility to educate the general public on those issues. But overall, you know, at the end of the day, as an attorney, you know, your role is to your client, whoever that may be, whether it's, you know, a private company, whether it's a government agency. So
I think that's a really insightful thinking, and in terms of, you know, I want to spin that question a little bit and send it to Alicia. You know, you think about, you know, our job as lawyers is to respond to the client and to, you know, make sure they're aware of things. But do we take it one step further in space law? Alicia, do you, both within your organization, outside of your organization, do lawyers play a role in driving policy objectives?
Thank you for that question. I think it's a really important one. And I have to agree with the statement about, you know, as in-house counsel, particularly if you're in the lead role, this goes back to what you learned in corporations and law school. You do have to constantly be aware of what your obligations are to the organization, right? Not to the people, the individuals, any particular item that may come up on a day-to-day basis. But beyond that, there are numerous opportunities to take a stake, play a role, influence policy. So if you are at an organization, a startup, or a large corporation in this industry, you'll come across this regularly. But for the students who are involved, there are also a lot of institutions that you can get involved with that would give you an opportunity for your voice to contribute potentially to or participate in some of the processes. So one example of this is that NASA is constantly looking to understand better the commercial considerations that sit on the other side of the work that they're doing, right? So both as part of the ISS transition plan as they look towards the orbit of the ISS itself in the coming years, and across the board, what you'll find is that what used to be posted at FedBizOps and is now posted at the System for Award Management, so sam.gov, you'll find details and information about, you know, research and announcements, opportunities to propose to the government, you know, products, services, programs, but also NASA has put out a large number of RFIs. So this represents their attempt to reach out to the broader public, to reach out to commercial entities, nonprofits, institutions that want to share with them important perspectives that they need to hear as they plan how to proceed and the way that they apply policies to their actual programs, actual contracts. So there is absolutely opportunity to influence and to play a role in the development of governmental policy. And that's just one example.
Yeah, I think that, and I think it also shows, again, so I'm going to keep going. I just love the statement you made when you started, so I'm going to keep going back to that, so this human trajectory. But yeah, I mean, space is for everyone, and everyone has an opportunity to get involved. And I think that's really one of the biggest misconceptions that I see is sort of this space is for Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk, but that's not true. We all have this opportunity to contribute to space law. We're starting to get the questions rolling in, but before we turn to those, I just want to ask Elsbeth, you know, what does an interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary education look like for a lawyer training to become a space lawyer for the 21st century?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think kind of jumping off actually what you were just saying with Alicia and the comments that she made is that our space assets and our space capabilities touch so many different industries, right? Whether we're talking about ag tech, whether we're talking about pure communications, there's so many different ways in which space intersects with all of these different industries and as an extension of that, all of these different disciplines. And of course, I'm particularly passionate about this because I have an interdisciplinary background and a love for the development side of technology. And so one of the things that we focus on here is not necessarily trying to force their people to be like me, right? Because you can't be a jack of multiple trades, right? My coding is now woefully out of date. That is not what I do day to day, right? And I don't think we have a reasonable expectation for professionals to say, you should design the rocket and also work on the launch contract. That probably doesn't makes sense, right? But this development of a common language and a common understanding of the process and how we're going to approach those processes. And so it's more about integrating our specialties and an ability to work together towards those common goals in a much more holistic approach, rather than being in these traditional sort of, particularly in academia, we see that in these siloed research models, right? And so what we're trying to do with a lot of the work that we're doing is break down the siloed walls and spend time together throughout these disciplines, working on projects together, not necessarily stepping on one another's specialties, but working together to determine the best place where the law begins to fit in, and to help, I think, a lot of engineers start to understand that lawyers aren't working against them. I think Andrew hit the nail on the head, saying a lot of people see the Outer Space Treaty and say, this is restricting everything I want to do in outer space. And I think that's where lawyers can really come in and help people who are developing space technology think about it in a broader sense. And that's a way in which we can cooperate and collaborate to achieve some of these ends potentially a little bit faster, and with less regulatory hiccups and bureaucracy that can sometimes slow up that process.
I think it's such an important point, and at the Journal of Space Law, we've actually published a bunch of articles talking about how we can actually make engineers and lawyers sit in a room together. So I think it's something we aspire to at Mississippi, to create that kind of a classroom situation. So I'm going to go into the audience questions. So we have one for Andrea. There's a big discussion on the military and their place in space. At the Mars Society convention, one presentation actually argues that military has no place in space. Can you discuss the uses of military in space, since the military has been involved in every Apollo mission and landing?
Happy to. Thank you, Michelle. So there's a few different points I want to get to here. So first, I think it's really important that the military does have a role in space. And I think the military's contributions, not only in terms of technology that was developed for the military and that has had other applications, but actually the military's direct contribution to space is really important. For example, if you take the GPS constellation that we all benefit from every day, we think about GPS in terms of navigation and our Google Maps and getting us from point A to point B. But GPS also manages the timing system that our banking system relies on. For example, our communication system relies on. Pumping gas relies on that GPS timing signal as well. And so you have a system that was designed for military use, that has a military use and purpose, but that has really changed the lives of people on Earth, not only in the United States, but beyond. And if we didn't have military engagement in space, we would not have those benefits coming forward there. Not to mention the treaty verification benefits, for example, through use of remote sensing, the improvements in weather forecasting that have come as a result of military satellites, et cetera. So I think that, looking to the role of the military in general, you can see that militaries have had a role in things that we don't think of as traditionally military activities, but for example, the Navy and the Coast Guard both play different roles in protection of commerce and protection of freedom of movement and operation at sea. And so Space Force could fill a similar role, and I think will fill a similar role in outer space. And then even if we look to Antarctica, where you have the Antarctic Treaty in place that prohibits a whole lot of military uses in Antarctica, there are exceptions that allow for use of military personnel and equipment for peaceful uses. And we've seen in Antarctica that military personnel and military equipment are used all the time for supply and transportation. Military pilots are flying aircraft in Antarctica. And I think so even when you get into celestial bodies, where there is a prohibition on what types of military activities can take place, there could still even be a role on celestial bodies like there is in Antarctica. But as far as outer space, the void of outer space, not celestial bodies, is concerned, the only treaty restriction in the Outer Space Treaty on military operations in the void of outer space is that you cannot put nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in Earth orbit. Beyond that, the restrictions that are in place on military activities are specifically tied to celestial bodies rather than the void of space itself. So there is not a prohibition on military activities in space from the perspective of the Outer Space Treaty. And even where there is significant limitation on celestial bodies, there's still a role that military can play there.
Thanks, Andrea. When I first was talking about this panel, I was thinking, God, it should be 90 minutes, but unfortunately we only have an hour. So we're gonna take one more question from the audience. I'm gonna throw it to Jessica. The question is, and I think it's a great one, where can I do pro bono work in space law to get exposure?
So I don't know specifically about about pro bono opportunities as I understand them, but there are many ways that you can get involved in particular space law groups, and it's a great method of networking with professionals in the industry as well. So just off the top of my head, I'm going to plug the AIAA legal aspects of aeronautics and astronautics committee. Is a group of lawyers who work within the space industry. You also have groups within the ABA, has a space law group. The American Society of International Law has a space law interest group, which I believe Elsbeth is the vice chair of. I have the correct position.
I'm the co-chair, but I was just the vice chair before that. So yes.
Yes, co-chair. But there are many different groups out there that you can take a part in, and whether it's helping to get speakers together for conferences, helping to host and prepare for conferences, maybe doing research or looking for journal topics to write about. These are all ways in which you can start to get a little bit of exposure, maybe outside of traditional things like either internships or on the job experience. The other thing too, I will say is don't underestimate just reaching out to practitioners in the field. I'd say almost all of us, I haven't run into anyone who hasn't been willing to at least sit down for 30 minutes over a cup of coffee or something to talk about their careers, to talk about the work that they've done, and to see how they can help you as well. And that's more geared towards students or sort of aspiring space lawyers, but there are multiple opportunities out there. Don't be shy, reach out to people.
I absolutely agree with that, Jessica. I always tell people the space law community in particular is very tight and very open and very embracing. And if you reach out to link in with me on LinkedIn, I will absolutely link in with you. I will respond to your comments. I'm happy to talk about it all the time. Does anybody, we have about 3 minutes left. Does anybody have anything to add to what Jessica said, or any other points to make at this point? So just, Alicia, go ahead.
Sure, it's just a really short snippet, which I think we've sort of heard underlying a number of the comments, which really is that space is not a spectator sport. And although sometimes it may seem intimidating because the goals are very lofty, because some of the brightest and best minds in the world are engaged in this work, there really is a place for everyone, and it will take all of us. It does not matter what your background or your discipline is. There is a way, if you're passionate about it, to find an involvement nexus. So I think we would all just encourage the spectators today to join in, become active in some way, because it really is not a spectator sport.
Thank you. I feel like you just took the air out of my balloon in terms of key takeaways, because I think that is the most significant takeaway we can have from this session, right? I mean, there is a way where there's a will, there's a way, there's room for everybody. But just to wrap up, I want to say that what we learned today, I think, is space activities are businesses. So you don't just go out and be a space lawyer. You need to bring in another area of expertise or another area of knowledge. Not necessarily expertise if you're just graduating law school. But show an interest in labor, cyber, administrative law, business law, insurance law. Everybody comes into it a different way, but we're looking for those broad range of experiences. Space law is for you if you are flexible and curious, and if you like dealing with novel issues. And ultimately, if you have an interest in influencing the trajectory of the human experience, of the human species, of our transition into a multiplanetary species, then this is the right place for you. At some point, we talked about how a lot of people just come into space law having taken a course on space law. I think within the next decade, we're going to actually see a flip in that. Every lawyer has to take constitutional law. Within 10 years, perhaps every lawyer will have to take space law because we won't be able to do anything on Earth without being affected somehow by space. So on that note, I want to thank my brilliant panelists, and again, thank Charles Startler for bringing us all together. I expect a real uptick in applications for the LLM program at the University of Mississippi School of Law, and of course Nebraska as well. But we are all here to help you and support you, and we are looking forward to training the next 21st century workforce. So thank you everybody so much for joining us, and thank you guys. Thank you again, panelists. Thank you.